Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's free cloud webinar, the benefits of the modern cloud with AWS, brought to you by Pluralsight. Organizations can shift entire workloads to cloud and yet still not achieve the most transformational benefits of the cloud. So today, with the help of our special international guest, we will be reviewing the approaches that can lead companies to reducing long-term maintenance, increasing the speed of digital innovation, and enabling them to respond to user needs more quickly. This session will review real-world scenarios for implementing these modern cloud techniques into existing organizations. Hello to each and every one of you. My name is Shobit Khanna, and I'll be your moderator today. Now, we've still got some people joining us in the back rows. So while they do that, let me quickly take you through some housekeeping. Now, please note that this is a listen-only mode webinar, and you guys are all on mute, but we do encourage you to interact with us today, and you can do that during the webinar or after the webinar in the Q&A panel. We would love to be able to get to all of your burning questions throughout. And of course, do keep an eye out for an exit survey, which you will receive at the end of the webinar to give us feedback on today's session, and of course, give us your thoughts on future topics as well. Okay, now we've got everyone settled in. Let me introduce you to our special guest for this morning, David Tucker. David is a Webby Award-winning cloud development consultant that focuses on cloud-native web, mobile, and IoT applications. For over 15 years as a consultant, David has led custom software development on emerging platforms for companies such as FedEx, AT&T, Sony Music, Intel, Comcast, Herman Miller, Principal Financial, and Adobe. And trust me, that list goes on. David regularly writes and speaks on the digital landscape with published works for O'Reilly and lynda.com, and he's obviously an established author at Pluralsight as well. He has written for Mashable, Smashing Magazine, and VentureBeat, and he has spoken at events like AdTech, Interop, and Adobe Max. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to David, who's joining us his nighttime from the US. Welcome back, David.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm glad to always get a chance to chat with you all, and there's so much to talk about because I feel like we're at such a transformational time in terms of the cloud. I think every time we think we've maybe reached the apex of when transformation with the cloud can happen, we see new things happen. Even I was just kind of hearing about some of the news around the funds to actually push digital economy within Australia. Hearing these things just really screams the cloud is going to play a central role in our organizations moving forward. And it's not just going to be something that helps us. It's actually going to be in many ways what drives us from a business perspective. So let me give you a little bit of a background. As Shobit mentioned, I spend basically all of my time talking about the cloud, whether that's through my work with my clients or whether that's what I do at Pluralsight. And I've had a great opportunity to work with a lot of different companies over my career. And through that, I've really begun to see what works and what doesn't work in terms of the cloud. So I want to be able to just have a great discussion with you about that today. Now, as a note here, I'm very interested in your questions. If there's a lot of questions in a certain area, I may shift kind of the conversation to that area. So even as I'm talking, feel free to be adding things in the Q&A pod here for the webinar. Now, to give you an idea, just in terms of some of the different areas I talk about just at Pluralsight, it's everything from beginning level certification paths, and we'll talk more about how that can help organizations in digital transformation in a minute, to how organizations do ops in terms of infrastructure as code, machine learning, and also very similar topics on Azure, from machine learning and even just working with Node.js on Azure. So there's a lot of different areas that I focus on. And I'll even give you another resource at the very end today that actually just launched today. You're actually the first group I've talked about this particular solution. So I'll be talking about that at the very end, some new resources. And these actually are free resources that you can leverage. So let me tell you what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about a topic that I think does have the ability to be transformational within companies, and that is the concept of how we build modern, what I call cloud native applications. And I have a very specific definition of what that means that we'll get to in just a minute. Also, I want to talk about how the cloud does help organizations embrace emerging technologies. I think sometimes we think of the cloud just as a place where we're able to deploy things, and we don't realize that in many cases it can enable us to bring on new technologies and gain new core competencies. We'll also briefly talk about AWS certifications as a way of helping organizations begin to talk the same language about the cloud. And I'll try to give a little bit, with time remaining, a little bit of a vision of the future in terms of what the cloud will enable organizations to do. So first, one point, and this is really a point I've been harping on for the last 3 years, is organizations that adopt a public cloud strategy can increase their speed of digital innovation. And I think this is such a key factor because it used to be that, cost optimization was the primary goal, or, reducing your digital footprint in terms of what you have to maintain was the goal. But really here, what we're seeing is speed is the ultimate goal. The ability for organizations to grow and shift and adapt to changing needs. I mean, this has never been more evident. This quote here from the CEO of Salesforce was before the pandemic era. And so now it's more evident than ever that organizations need to be able to shift quickly. And the truth is that most organizations spend so much time and effort simply maintaining what they have. The ability to grow and innovate in many cases just isn't there. Now, when we're talking about the cloud, I want to level set just a little bit here. We're going to be talking here about the public cloud. And again, meaning that we're going to be running our workloads on shared hardware over the public internet and managed by a cloud provider. There could be other great discussions we could have about the role of things like private cloud and hybrid cloud, but that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. I am going to be focused on the public cloud, and that really is my area of focus. And when we're talking about the public cloud, there's really 3 key players that we're talking about. But since the beginning, with Gartner's Magic Quadrant, since the beginning of them tracking cloud-based infrastructure, we have seen AWS being in the lead of pretty much every category. So for the purposes of our conversation today, even though I spend a lot of time working in Azure and GCP, for the purposes of today, we're going to be talking about Amazon Web Services, because I think it's very helpful to talk specifically about the cloud and not just in general. I think sometimes we have too many general conversations about the cloud. So I want to explain to you what a specific cloud platform can do for your overall strategy. And I want to start off with something that's going to be just a very basic level, but something that hopefully will get us all speaking the same language about the cloud to start with. And this is before we dive in and actually look at what we're going to be doing with cloud native applications that we'll get to in just a minute. So I really want to ask the question, is a public cloud approach really better than a traditional data center? I still know many organizations that are trying to answer this question, especially in heavily regulated industries. And so let's really compare that. Let's see what it looks like to build a traditional data center versus using a public cloud with Amazon Web Services. And if we go through this process, what we're going to see is that if we have a traditional application and we want to deploy something globally, let's say we have an application and we're going to start off with maybe Nashville, Tennessee, which is only about 2 hours from where I currently live. And you're going to need to have, some web components. You're going to need to have file storage. You're going to need to have a database, and you're going to need to stand those up within your own data center. And then if you choose to go into Europe, you're going to need to do the same thing there. And the amount of time it's going to take you to get up and running, even if you're co-locating your resources, is probably going to be weeks to months. And then if you want to expand your data center in Nashville because things there are becoming very successful, you're still going to take weeks to months to be able to get that additional capacity. And then if you decide to expand into Singapore, you're going to have to go in and build entirely new relationships and then deploy your resources there. And this is a timely process. And anytime we're managing our own data centers, we have to deal with the challenge, and that is the challenge of handling demand within your data center. And so here, if we see that we have a demand curve, let's say this is our demand month to month, this is what it would take to support all of the users. If we have now this capacity being the gray area behind the yellow bars, what we see is that we have 2 distinct problems. And these are problems that have plagued organizations that manage their own data center for years. We either have one of 2 situations. We either have unused capacity, meaning that we're paying for more than what we need, or we're going to have demand over capacity. And in those situations, we know that that means we have users that are going to be losing their access. They're going to have requests that fail. There are going to be problems that exist. And so because of that, let's look at what it costs then to build a data center. We're going to have large upfront capitalized expenditures. And then we're going to have these operational expenditures that will grow over time. And every time we need to build a larger data center, we're going to see that we're going to have those large upfront expenses again. So this creates a lot of challenges. And I could sit here and go through each of these, but in essence, it just means we're not going to be able to move as fast as we could, and we're going to own all the burden ourselves. Now let's talk about how we do this in the cloud. And this will be the foundation of what we'll talk about as we move into talking about building applications in 2021. So if we're handling demand in the cloud, we gain the ability to grow and shrink the resources that we have to fit whatever demand we have. And this is a concept called elasticity. Now, this is essential when we're dealing with situations where, because of changing business climates, we might have twice as many or half as many users one day as we do the next. And long gone are the days where we manually configure these things, by hand. We actually now need to have systems that do this themselves. And what we gain by this is that we now have costs that are tied to usage. And in many cases, there will be cost savings associated with this, especially if you no longer have to maintain your data centers. But one of the key abilities here is to tie cost to usage, as opposed to large upfront costs that you simply have to do before you can even build something out. So this approach also has many benefits. But one of the key things I want to point out with this is you really can increase your speed and agility because you're taking advantage of a pool of resources that are much, much larger than you could have previously. And the other thing here that's critical, because I'll go to many organizations, I've been to a lot of financial services organizations, and they'll say, we're really good at managing our own data centers, and we just don't think we're going to gain a lot by moving to the cloud. We don't think we're going to save a lot of money. But here's one of the things I will say. You can benefit from the massive economies of scale when you're working with a cloud provider like AWS. When you go out and buy 2 servers, they're going to go out and buy 20,000. And in addition, the way that they maintain those servers, they can probably have, one person maintain 20 times as much as what you can as an organization, because they have operationalized it at such a large scale. Now, with that being said, let me just answer a few questions around security before we dive into cloud native applications. Because I still, even in 2021, will get the question, isn't putting our data, especially sensitive, regulated data, in the public cloud, isn't that insecure? And I'll tell you that several years ago, the attitude on this shifted within the United States. And there were really 3 breaches that happened within a few year span. And the one that really changed people's mind was Anthem Healthcare. And all of a sudden, as a consultant, I went from my client saying, I can't put my data in the cloud, it's insecure, to those organizations saying, I can't keep my data in my own data center, it's insecure. Because we're seeing now, and Gartner even kind of has agreed with this as well, that through 2020, public cloud infrastructure as a service will suffer 60% fewer incidents than those in traditional data centers. So we're actually seeing that, on the whole, putting our data in the cloud is a better bet for security than us trying to keep it within our own data centers. And there's a lot of things behind that. This would be a whole other talk as to why this is. But even the ability for Amazon, for example, to go in and deploy critical vulnerability patches at a moment's notice is something that, again, they have operationalized at a massive scale. Now, with all that said, let me ask a question. Should we just build our apps the same way in the cloud, the same way that we've always built them? And I can't tell you how many organizations I walk into, and they're still building their applications the same way they were 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. And one of the points that I want to drive home is, if you really want to achieve the benefits of the cloud, so these benefits that I've talked about, you are going to have to change how you build solutions. And how do you have to change it? Well, I think that any application that really needs to achieve all of the benefits of the cloud needs to be built in a cloud native way. And I define a cloud native application with an application that meets these 4 pillars that I'm going to mention. Now, before I tell you what those are, I will say you'll run into a lot of people that use the term cloud native. Now, a lot of them are trying to sell you something and using the term cloud native. What I mean by this is simply saying that something that is cloud native is a solution that is built for the cloud, not something that you just built for your own data center and just happen to move it to the cloud. And so we really see four characteristics, four pillars of these cloud native applications. First of all, we have this concept of microservices. And this means that instead of building these large, massive, what we would call monolithic systems, we're now breaking our applications up into these smaller modular components. And the cloud really enables us to do this because now we can spin up container-based workloads or serverless workloads, and we can have as many of them as we need, and we can scale them to whatever point we need to scale them to. This also fits with how software is built in 2021, with smaller, decentralized, agile teams having the ability to make decentralized decisions on the specific area that they're working in. And so we're seeing that this has been adopted because of both its technical benefits and process benefits. And we'll talk more about microservices in a minute. Another one, and actually the biggest one out of these four, is the concept here of managed services. So if we have the opportunity to build something and maintain it ourselves, or choose to use a managed service from a cloud provider, we should always choose the managed service whenever possible, as long as it meets our needs. Next, continuous delivery. Learning to consider that the application code and the code that automates deployment are equally important. Releasing software is one of the biggest wastes of time for organizations when they have so many manual processes included. So continuous delivery is all about automating this process as much as possible. And then a concept we've already discussed, elasticity, meaning that however we build our applications, they should be able to grow and shrink based on user demand. So briefly, let's talk a bit about this first pillar of microservices. So as I mentioned, you're building your applications now in these smaller, more modular units that can be deployed and evolve every single day. And this is one of the key differences. When you look at these digital native companies, they're deploying a lot of their services 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times per day. Every time changes are made, there's testing that is performed so they can have confidence in their releases, and they continually release. Any organization that has the ability to innovate is going to have an optimized release process. Now, here we can see that companies like, again, Airbnb, Disney, Dropbox, so many, and I love this list because it's some digital native companies, it's some, here in the States, at least, 100-year-old companies, they're all seeing benefits by using techniques like microservices. Another concept here is managed services. And as I mentioned, I think this one is the most critical. There was a time, and again, my background is in software development and architecture. So I'm somebody who wrote code on a daily basis for a majority of my career before I shifted over to more of the strategy and leadership side, although I still write a fair amount of code. But with this being said, there used to be this thought of, we want to be able to build and control everything. And the truth is what happens with those systems over time is that people spend so much time having to maintain those custom solutions that you've built, there isn't any time left to innovate. And we see that the maintenance requirements for an application increase over time, not linearly, usually more logarithmically. They will increase over time to the point where the maintenance demands actually outstrip the benefit of the application. And this happens with systems that are 20 years old. It can even happen with systems that are 1 year old, depending on how they were built. Well, one of the ways we can get past this is by choosing solutions that are managed for us. Now, let's use an example here of looking at compute in the cloud. So I'm going to put this spectrum here on the screen. And if we look at the far left of this spectrum, we're going to have maximum control. And if we're going to look to the far right, we're going to have minimum maintenance. And one of the things I want to point out here is that these two are always diametrically opposed. You can't have a solution that is both maximum control and minimum maintenance. So here, when we're looking at this, if we look to the far left in the cloud, we're going to have infrastructure as a service, which just means we're spinning up our own virtual servers in the cloud. If we go all the way over to the right, this is going to be software as a service, where we're simply leveraging a service that another provider has given us access to. And then there's multiple levels in between these two. I've got platform as a service, but we would also have functions as a service. There would be other approaches that we can integrate in. Now, with that understanding, let me show you another spectrum. And this one's kind of going to be flipped from what the last one was. So if we look here at specific AWS services, if we go over to the left, we're going to have AWS Lambda. And this is going to be in many ways one of the easier compute solutions to implement, because you simply give it your application code, it's going to run it for you within its own environment. We could go over to Amazon EC2. We would have a lot more control because this in essence is just spinning up a virtual machine, but we've also got a lot more here that we have to maintain, right? As a reminder, one of the greatest data breaches here in the US is of Equifax, a company that had a massive data breach of 250 million users, their data, and it was caused by an individual not updating patches onto virtual machines. Now, we also can have other solutions like Fargate, ECS, EKS, all of these different solutions, and I won't spend too much time talking about each of them and what they do, but each of these solutions gives you a different level of control. But here's the catch. When we go to the far right, we have more control, but we also have more risk. And with this, organizations should always build to the minimum amount of risk required for a solution. What this also does is this also gives the organization a minimum amount of maintenance for the solutions that they build. And this, in many cases, is a shift from how architects thought about building applications for the last 10, 20 years, because now we're saying, no, if we need to change the way we build our application so we can take advantage of specific managed services to decrease the amount of time we have to spend maintaining it over the long term, that time is worth it now so that we get it back later. Another concept, again, is elasticity. We've already talked about this, but in essence, you should build on systems that can grow and shrink, either systems that have it built in, right? Like a Lambda, DynamoDB, some of the other AWS services that enable that, or things that enable you to have that control, like using something like an auto scaling group within EC2. And again, if you're not familiar with all of these services, the core concepts remain the same, irrespective of which of the AWS services you're choosing. Now, continuous delivery, and I talked about this a little bit in the beginning when we talked about microservices, but this is really just saying that when we're creating new solutions, from the beginning, we need to consider that release process just as important as the code that we write for our applications, because you can never move faster than your organization's release process. I had a chance to work with a B2B e-commerce company here in the States, and they do about 12 billion a year US dollars in terms of revenue through their e-commerce platform. So they considered this to be about 90% of their revenue. And they were so concerned that there was going to be a problem with shipping updates to their e-commerce platform, that their release cycle took 9 weeks. 9 weeks to make changes, take it through different levels of testing, get whatever approvals were needed, and then ultimately get that, whatever innovation they had, get that out to their end users. And really what we're seeing now in today's climate, if you can't do this in 1 week, or ideally if you can't do this in a few days, you're going to be behind. And the way that you get here is by fully automating the process, not just automating a basic level of testing per commit, a concept that we would call continuous integration, but really seeing everything be automated. Even if you're not deploying every day, you need to be able to deploy whenever you choose to. And that would be what we call continuous delivery. And this requires a new level of skills. This requires a new skill set that, again, a lot of organizations, to be honest, don't have. And they're going to have to figure out how they equip their current technical resources to grow into this skill set, or they go out and find people. But training and upskilling individuals is going to be a key component of organizations being able to embrace this. And a lot of times we'll see this fall under a general concept of DevOps, but really it's grown beyond that, where we really see this merge between how we do development and how we handle operations. So at this point, why would you want to embrace this cloud native approach that I've mentioned? Well, I believe that there are a lot of reasons, but one of the key reasons is I've seen a lot of organizations learn to just build less. They've eliminated, in some cases, 30% of their custom development when they've embraced this cloud native approach. And so what we see with that, for example, if organizations were used to setting up their own database stacks, and so maybe they're deploying something like Postgres on virtual machines that they manage, and they've scripted their own backup process. And well, guess what? There's a couple solutions on AWS that can take care of a lot of that for you. If you really do want to use Postgres, you can switch over to using something like Amazon RDS, which is their relational database service. And all of those operational components of that are built in for you. You can scale by simply responding and telling your RDS cluster, hey, we need more instances, we need more replicas. Or you can even take it a step further and you can choose to change how you model your data and leverage a NoSQL database if it fits your use case and take advantage of something like DynamoDB. And in that case, depending on how you configure it, you might not ever have to worry about capacity. It's simply going to grow with you up to 20 million requests per second, which is what Amazon.com, that's the rate they've actually been able to use DynamoDB at for their critical workloads. So there are tools here that can handle pretty much any scale you throw at it, and at the same time, reduce the amount of maintenance that you have for the long term. So with that being said, let me go ahead and shift ahead just a little bit because I want to talk about some anti-patterns that I see by organizations when they're using the cloud. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I am very opinionated about the cloud. So I'm going to call out some things here, and these might even be some strategies that you've seen. So the first anti-pattern that I see is multi-cloud. Now, I don't mean that organizations that choose multi-cloud are always making a bad decision. But what I mean is, if we're saying that we have to make applications that can run on any cloud, that is an anti-pattern. I believe that when you build a business critical application, whether that's something that's internal or something external, you need to build it for a specific cloud platform. Because if you don't, you're simply going to be building to the lowest common denominator. Let me give you an example. If we want to look at the machine learning capabilities that exist within AWS, we're going to be looking at the capabilities that they have within the SageMaker suite. If you want to build it over on Azure, you're going to be looking at the Azure ML suite. Those suites are both very powerful, and I've done courses on both of them, but they're not the same. And if you want to actually integrate between the two of them, you're going to have to build now to the lowest common denominator. You're not going to get to take advantage of some of the features like hyperparameter optimization that exists on both platforms, but they exist in different ways. If we want to look at databases, DynamoDB, as I've already mentioned on AWS, is an extremely powerful database, the same database that powers Amazon.com. And Cosmos DB is a great multimodal database on Azure that's phenomenal, that can do a lot of different things. But those two databases are not the same. You can't simply say, okay, I'm going to point my application to one and then point it to the other, because they're different. You model data differently and you interact with it differently. So if you want to truly achieve the benefits of reducing your maintenance and increasing your speed of innovation, when you build an application, it needs to be for a specific cloud platform. Next, I see a lot of organizations think, you know what, I still have to spin up virtual servers, or I still have to use containers within a complex container orchestration platform like Kubernetes. And the truth is that, again, in many cases, you don't. There's solutions like AWS Lambda. And at times, I think some organizations look at solutions like Lambda and think that, well, this is for people and organizations that don't really know how to manage complex enterprise software yet. However, we saw at the reInvent keynote for AWS last year that CEO Andy Jassy said that when Amazon.com is building new services, 40% of those are running on AWS Lambda and not running on something like Kubernetes. So when you can, again, build to simpler solutions that will reduce the amount of maintenance you have to perform long term. And in addition, just finding talent that understands many of those complex systems, to be honest, that's extremely challenging at this point. Those people are in high demand. And many organizations, again, they don't have the scale that's needed. They don't have the scale. Most organizations don't have the scale of a Netflix or a Facebook or a Google. And so you can look at simpler solutions for solving your problems. However, another anti-pattern, and one that I want to call out, because especially if you're starting a cloud transformation within your organization, I want you to know ahead of time something that you need to avoid, and that is something that I would call manual infrastructure. So over the last 20 years, we've completely optimized how we've handled software development. And we've got great things like, Git as a version control system, and we now have processes for doing things like a pull request workflow with developers. But in many cases, we just throw that away when we think about operations in the cloud. And what we can do is we can leverage solutions like CloudFormation on AWS, or solutions like Terraform, which is a cross-platform solution, or Pulumi, which is also a cross-platform solution. And basically, they enable us to write our infrastructure like we write our code. So if we want to spin up a database cluster, we don't go into the AWS console, or we don't go to the CLI and simply type in, hey, give me a new database cluster. We configure it within code, and then we track that with our application. And this is why we've seen a rise of concepts like mono repos, for example, where organizations are putting their front-end code, their back-end code, their infrastructure code, all in the repository together so that they can make sure that they have a single version that they're dealing with. Now, let me answer another question for you here, and that is, can the cloud really help us innovate? Well, I want to talk through an example here where we look at what it would take if we wanted to implement machine learning solutions traditionally versus if we wanted to implement machine learning solutions from a cloud native perspective. And this is actually loosely based off of a project that I had with a client that was going through this similar dilemma. So if we did a traditional approach, and I've seen a lot of organizations take this route, here's what you'd have to do. You'd have to go out and hire new team members that have completely new skills. And finding new people with new skills, this is challenging in and of itself, because knowing how to properly vet those individuals and find the right people is challenging. You're also going to have to go out and order some new GPU-based hardware. When we see, especially for our machine learning training workflows, you're going to need to have some extremely powerful machines, and you're going to need to install those and provision them. You're going to have to build out a data science approach for your organization, which includes defining how your data is going to flow, through the process. And then ultimately at that point, you can start testing what we would call machine learning models. And then eventually you can actually operationalize those. But here's the catch. You don't really get any benefit to your organization until the very end of this cycle, which means you're throwing in, half a year at minimum, plus a lot of money to make this happen. And one of the things we know is that if we can take things in a little bit more of an agile approach, we can get benefits sooner. It's going to help us decide where to commit as an organization. And this falls under that general concept of fail fast. So let's talk about how we do that when we're leveraging a public cloud platform like AWS. And one of the things I want to call out is Amazon has a suite of AI services, and Microsoft has this as well with their cognitive services, and Google has similar things as well. And what these are software as a service solutions that you can integrate with, and you can get the benefits of using machine learning, but without having to go all in right at the beginning. And for Amazon, these are services like Comprehend, Lex, Forecast, Textract, and I'll look at Forecast for just a minute. Forecast is a great service that enables you to go in and predict data based on other data. So if you have 20 different metrics and you want to predict a correlated metric, like maybe your sales data, well, what's sales going to be like in December based on all these other numbers? You can use Forecast to do what we would call a linear regression model to help determine what that data needs to be. Textract is another great one, and I actually just integrated it into a course that actually will be released tomorrow on Pluralsight. A Textract is a great way to go in and get structured data out of like forms that people have filled out by hand or PDF documents that you have lying around. If you want to get data out, you can use a service like this. Then they have Kendra, Transcribe, Fraud Detector, Recognition, which is their computer vision service, Personalize, Translate, Poly. There's all of these services. And let's talk about how you can use them, not the specifics of the services, but at a high level, how you could implement something like this within your organization. So you could start off here and say, okay, just like we take the other approach, we're going to do some research in the beginning. But now, instead of having to go out and hire a full data science team, let's say that we use a solution like Amazon Forecast, and we take a small group of developers to do a spike with some sample data that we already have, and let's figure out if we can actually get some valuable insights out of a linear regression model. Okay, now that you do that, and if you see, yes, as an organization, this is valuable, we want to move forward, now you could look at leveraging something like a full data science team. You could start that hiring process. But instead of going all in at the beginning, you could leverage a solution like SageMaker Autopilot to take your data and create a personalized model based on your data, but yet you still don't have to fully create it. The service will do that for you. And then if you got all the benefit out of that and you really wanted to customize it, then you could look at building out a custom pipeline, a custom continuous delivery pipeline for your machine learning models. So what this does is this gives you time to mature in your approach, but yet still achieve benefit for your organization sooner rather than later. And so what I've seen is that the cloud really can enable you to onboard emerging technologies in a fraction of the time. We know now that cryptocurrencies and quantum ledgers and other things are extremely popular for certain types of applications. And I knew organizations that jumped in right at the beginning and they maintained their own, maybe they were setting up their own Ethereum clusters and they wanted to do this all themselves. And the truth is that organizations that chose instead to let the public cloud providers build this out, and now they're able to go in and leverage services like QLDB or managed blockchain from AWS, they're able to now have solutions that can do what they need it to do, but without the burden of having to continually maintain that themselves, like many of those initial organizations were doing. And what this means overall is, going back to that point I had at the beginning, that you can really increase your speed of digital innovation when you adopt this effective public cloud strategy and you choose to build cloud native applications. Now, I want to touch on another topic here. And I'm going to touch this hopefully in a way that you're not maybe quite used to. And that is that I believe that certifications can help organizations in a shift towards a transformation. And the reason that I think that is, one of the most powerful things within an organization is when people start using the same terms to talk about a specific technology. Previously, you might have people that do things one way in this group and another way in another group, and they talk about it differently. And we see that communication is really hard to grow. And within these organizations, it's hard for them to develop what we would call communities of practice, where you have people working in similar technologies, building these effective kind of cross-team groups that really help shape how the organization uses it. And one of the ways you can foster that is by pushing forward with an agenda of certifications, specifically in the cloud. And one of the things I would recommend here is this foundational level certification on AWS, which is the Cloud Practitioner certification, is one of the best at helping with that transformation, because it enables people to get an understanding of the fundamental concepts of using AWS and architecture and security and the core services that you would use, so that now when people are talking about solutions on AWS, they're really coming at it from a common ground. And I really think here that, again, everyone in a technical role or even connected to a technical role should start with this Cloud Practitioner certification. And one of the reasons for that is this knowledge is fair game on every other certification exam. And once they get past this initial certification, really what role they're in will determine where they go next. But the Cloud Practitioner certification is something that really, again, is beneficial for any resource that has any connection to technology on AWS. And one of the things I do want to call out, we do have a great learning path that goes through all of that at Pluralsight. And one of the things that I've been really pleased with this is we've had a lot of people just reach out and talk about how, teams within their whole organization got together and went through this. So with that being said, I could walk you through the different resources that we have for that, but I'll tell you this up front, that even if you don't have a ton of experience with AWS, if you commit to working on this, it can be something that your team members can start achieving within just a few months. And if they already have some existing experience, they can do that even quicker. We do have several video courses that help with that, as well as study guides and guided notes, and even a complete course to help them get ready for the exam. And so this is something we believe is powerful and does play a role in transformation. Now, another thing I want to point out, and what I hope is a valuable resource for you, is today we released, Pluralsight released a new series that I'm hosting called Cloud Tracker. And what this is a way to help your resources within your organization stay up to date with the changing cloud platforms that exist. Because this is a mammoth task. When you have AWS, Google Cloud Platform, and Azure, they're always releasing new services that could fundamentally change how you build applications. And they're always releasing new updates, and there's new resources that are out there. And it's hard. I mean, it would take 10 to 20 hours a week for someone to keep track of all of those. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to condense that down to about 10 to 15 minutes per month for each of the cloud platforms. And so your resources can stay up to date. And here's the great thing. Even if you're not subscribing to Pluralsight, even if you don't have accounts, you can take advantage of this resource totally for free on YouTube. We want people to stay informed. And as a part of this, we will be pointing out resources on the Pluralsight content library that we think are beneficial, but it's something that I wanted to be sure to point out. Now, I want to talk about a few things kind of as we start winding down here. And as a note, here in about 2 or 3 minutes, as we start to jump into questions, be sure that you've had a chance to write down any questions you have about what we've gone through today. And I'll take time up to the top of the hour to answer any questions that we do have. But let me talk about a few concepts that I think are critical to embrace for organizations that are looking to truly achieve the benefits of the modern cloud. One of them I've already touched on briefly, and that is this concept of infrastructure as code. So just as you've learned, again, how to maintain and manage code for your custom applications, learning to do that with your infrastructure is crucial. Picking a solution and having a team pilot it within your organization and developing standards around how you use it, I think this is essential. And if you are working within AWS, looking at solutions like CloudFormation, serverless application model, cloud development kit, these are the kinds of solutions that are going to be essential to your success. If you have people going in manually, again, creating infrastructure, adding in configurations, you're going to have failures in the cloud, especially when you're trying to implement continuous delivery. So take advantage of these features within infrastructure as code. The next thing I would encourage you to look at is a serverless architecture. And I actually have a series focused at developers and architects that's going to be launching tomorrow in the States. It's a series of 11 courses on Pluralsight to help walk through this concept of a serverless architecture. And what this is ways of really optimizing that cloud native approach that I mentioned earlier, using solutions like AWS Lambda and DynamoDB and API Gateway to create the kinds of solutions that we have, but in a fraction of the time and with a fraction of the maintenance over the life of the application. And I believe that this is essential for organizations. Just as I mentioned that Amazon.com is choosing to launch 40% of their services on Lambda, I think most organizations could probably launch 40 to 60% of the services that they're owning and maintaining using a serverless approach. And then the rest of them can run as containers, run infrastructure as a service, depending on what the needs are. And then the other one that I want to call out here is, again, just looking at new databases and new approaches for managing data in the cloud. There's a lot of power that we get with these databases that were built for the cloud from day one and not just as traditional databases. And this is where we see the rise of NoSQL databases over traditional relational databases. And again, NoSQL databases don't fit every use case, but when they do, they can give you a scale that is hard to achieve with relational databases. And so this is something I believe is also important for you to check out. So with all that being said, I'm going to stop talking for just a minute. I'm going to hand it back over to Shobit for just a second as you all have time to go in and enter your questions, and then I'll tackle the questions as they come in.
Thank you very much for that, David. Extremely insightful as always. While everyone is writing their questions through and thinking about their questions, just a quick reminder for the exit survey, which you will receive at the end of the webinar. We would love to get your feedback on today's session and suggestions for future topics as well. And of course, also keep an eye out for the recording that will hit your inboxes within the next 1 or 2 days. And of course, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about AWS or cloud in general, and how Pluralsight can certainly help your teams upskill in those areas, check out pluralsight.com, or you can reach out to me directly as well. I'll leave my email in the chat box as well. With that, certainly, David, we can see if any questions do come through. I mean, one question that obviously I think about as well, and I hear a lot, is there is sometimes an aspect of senior management who need to be convinced still. We've had our budget announcement in Australia yesterday, and we all want to move towards the digital economy. So there is definitely pressure from the federal level to become digital. Yet there are still conversations that need to be had to convince that senior management about moving away from on-prem to at least in hybrid or full cloud. What are your suggestions on the type of conversations that can be had?
Absolutely, and that is a great question. And again, one that is still happening. But to your point, it's still happening in most every organization that I touch at some level, even if it's just a smaller group within the overall organization. Here's what I'd say. As we look at this, I think one of the fundamental things that we need to be sure that we're communicating is we're not just moving where we put our data. It's not just, hey, we're going to choose to, instead of having a virtual machine here, we're going to put it in the public cloud. And I think that for a lot of organizations, that's still where this conversation is happening, because they say things like, well, it costs us this much to run this virtual machine here. It costs us this much to run it in the cloud. I don't see that much of a difference. We probably shouldn't change. And if your conversation is about cost, I honestly believe you're missing a majority of the conversation. Because here, what we're looking at is a fundamental shift in how we use technology and in where that maintenance work exists. And if we want to be able to be an organization that can truly increase that speed of digital innovation, we're going to need to be able to take advantage of the capabilities that are provided by these cloud providers. I think most people at this point, if they're honest, have to say, yep, I don't think that as an organization, we have all the core competencies that Microsoft, Facebook, Google, and Amazon have in terms of managing technology. And we can just all admit, hey, that's okay. But we can still take advantage of them by developing an effective strategy that uses their public cloud platforms to help us innovate as an organization. Because we're going to continue to see disruptive companies come in. We're going to continue to see even organizations that think they're in verticals that are not at risk. We're seeing that disruptive organizations can come in, and organizations will have to learn sooner or later how to innovate faster than they currently do. And I still think there's nothing that's going to equip that more than the public cloud. So if you're having those conversations, if it's coming back to cost, I would just, again, you need to be able to paint a picture of where things are going to be in 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and ask yourselves, what happens if we don't move any faster than we are now? And chances are there's going to be a company that will come in and will disrupt the vertical that you're in.
That's great. Thank you, David. And certainly cost does play a role when you're trying to make such a decision. I think perhaps another aspect could be, security, of data and so forth on the cloud. Are there certain, reservations that you have come across personally when speaking to, that level, the decision maker level?
It's a great question. And so I'll give you kind of an example with this. We were working here in the States, one of the most heavily regulated, and this is really true pretty much anywhere, but one of the most heavily regulated areas of data has to do with healthcare data. So individual patient data is heavily regulated under a regulation here that we call HIPAA. And with that, some organizations, especially in the beginning, were saying, well, man, if we're heavily regulated, we just can't put our data in the cloud. There's too much risk. And we saw, as I mentioned, Anthem and many others, the breaches happened within their own data centers for these organizations. And so I was a part of helping a major hospital network here in the US, had over 200 hospitals all across the country, that actually shifted their entire platform over to AWS. And what they saw was, for them, this was safer than keeping the data in their own data center. Now, this was a large investment, but this was an investment because they believed it would improve their speed of digital innovation. It ultimately would improve security, and it would also shift a large portion of that risk away from them to the cloud provider. Now, there would be a whole other talk that we could have around how you share those responsibilities between a customer and a cloud provider. But what we're seeing is that organizations that can take advantage of that, again, they're going to get benefits of being associated with somebody like Amazon from a security perspective, because Amazon's sitting on the board that's reviewing these critical vulnerabilities along with Microsoft and Google. They're going to get to apply their patches before it's even released to the public for some of these critical vulnerabilities, and they're able to do it at scale in a fraction of the time it would take you to do it. I remember when we had the whole issues with critical vulnerabilities, the Heartbleed vulnerability, and many others 5-6 years ago, and you saw that on day one all the public cloud infrastructure had their issues fixed, where people that were having to maintain their own servers, they were still figuring out, oh my goodness, how do we do this? How do we deploy it? And so being able to operate at that scale is going to put any organization that's operating on the public cloud, especially ones that are using managed services, a step ahead of organizations that are trying to do it themselves.
Fantastic. Yep. Thank you very much for that. And certainly, everyone on the call, there's so much content around cybersecurity and cloud security, on the Pluralsight platform, as well as just out in the general internet on YouTube and so forth. So if this is a concern, I would urge you to go and have a look at some of that content up there as well.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, there you go ahead, David.
I was just going to mention, and cybersecurity continues to be at the forefront. I mean, right now, less than a mile from my house, people are lining up to get gas because a major pipeline here in the U.S. closed down because of a ransomware attack from a hacking group out of Eastern Europe. So again, this is only going to increase, and these skills, again, in many cases, you can't go out and find these individuals. So being able to equip your resources with the skills to grow in these areas is going to be essential.
Absolutely. It's so important it's paramount to stay ahead of the curve on this, and ideally one step ahead of any attacks and so forth. Absolutely. Thank you. I don't see any questions coming through at this point. David, if you have any closing remarks, it's all yours.
Perfect. I would just say again, I would encourage you to point your resources to the totally free Cloud Tracker series that I mentioned earlier. It's a great way to just help your resources stay up to date with what's going on in the cloud, because it is a very fast moving space. And this is just one of the ways at Pluralsight we wanted to be sure that people were able to get that information and get pointed in the right direction when it comes to working on AWS, Azure, and GCP.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. I think we'll call it at that, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. And again, I do urge you to research all of the topics we've spoken about, general internet and Pluralsight as well. Feel free to reach out to myself and also to David via LinkedIn and other channels. Thank you, David, for joining. I know it's late yours now. I'm sure you want to sort of wind down at this point. And thank you, everyone else, for joining. Have a lovely day, and we'll see you all back very soon.
Thank you all.